And so I think the first step that needs to be taken, and it's a very pragmatic, realistic one, is that every Hindu and every Sikh and every Buddhist and every Jain and every Christian needs to give some thought to how they're going to defend themselves. Not for a moment am I advocating that we should recommend or permit everyone to carry guns and so on and so forth. We don't want the nonsense that's happening in the United States. Having
No.
said that, with the Bharatiya community, I don't think we'd have that nonsense anyway, even if the Bharatiyas were to decide that that's what the society wanted to do. Cannibals and vegetarians cannot live together in harmony. One believes it thrives on consuming the other, and the sooner the vegetarians realize that they're in the company of cannibals, the sooner they unite, the sooner they coordinate their resources and their efforts, the sooner they find voices, the sooner they find leaders, and then they can repel the onslaught of dogmatic cannibals. And so
Yeah.
sadly, we're going to see even more gaslighting from the BBC. We're going to see even more New York Times articles which are based on nothing other than atrocity literature. And
Yeah.
as Hindus, each and every time this happens to us, we should use it as an opportunity to be able to, one, speak loudly against it, and two, hold each other tighter and stronger and make our bonds really, really firm so that we can navigate this and get to the stage where Bharat can stand up and share its vision for the benefit of the world.
Namaste and welcome to Chitti Media's Current Affairs show. Today we'll be talking about the recent events in Udaipur, and to discuss matters further, I have my esteemed guest today, Pandit Satish Sharma, that many of you know. I don't really need to introduce him. He's a wonderful guest full of lots of knowledge, but we are going to talk about the recent atrocities that have been happening in Udaipur. Panditji, welcome.
Namaskar, Sloniji. Pranam, Jai Shri Ram. Guruvyo Namah. Thank you for the invitation. This is such a serious subject to speak about, and I think we're all reeling from the news of what happened to Kanhaiya Lal and the devastating condition that his family find themselves in now. So before we jump into the detail, I'd just like to extend my condolences, but also the condolences of everybody here at Citti Media. Our thoughts are with them, and we have no wishes other than Paramatma gives them the strength to be able to navigate this time and to come through. And I hope that the community comes together to give them all the support that they need.
Yes, we've currently raised, I believe, a crore now. I remember donating this morning. Yes, it's very sad. He was just a humble tailor, only 46 years old, with a family to support, and it's a concern how Pakistani Muslims, because I say Pakistani because I believe the two people that committed these atrocities, it was Mohammed Ghous and Riaz Akhtori. They actually belong to a Pakistani group called the Dawat Pakistani Islamic group. And it's quite worrying how they think very different to the Saudi Muslims. But Banditji, how do we move forward from here?
Much of what you've said is perfectly correct. They do seem to have been trained in Pakistan, but there is an issue which I think we really need to address head on. Firstly, even if what she had said was not correct, even if what she had said innocently but others took offense to it, it still does not mean that you can demand the end of life for somebody. It doesn't mean that you can kill somebody on that basis. This is not the way in which civilized societies function. So, putting that to one side, we still then have the issue of how did it get to this particular point and what was the reaction. The remarks that Nupur Sharma made, they're reminiscent of remarks that Kamlesh Tiwari made. His were more emotive and he was killed. Rinku Sharma, completely innocent, he was killed. And we used to hear cases in Pakistan where an allegation was made against a person. If there was a dispute with some Hindu or some Sikh family or some member in Pakistan, an allegation would be leveled at them that they had burned the Quran or torn some pages out, and there'd be a riot and they'd be killed, and houses and so on would be burned. But we hadn't seen that happening in Bharat, and certainly not in Rajasthan. But that seems to be happening now. And so it's almost as though there is a group who have decided that irrespective of what the law says, irrespective of what human rights say, irrespective of every decent principle that humanity has managed to piece together for prosperous existence, this group can decide what's offensive to them. It can decide what reaction should be dictated. It can decide on what the punishment is, and then it can decide to execute the punishment. This is a complete rejection of the whole function of law and order. And I think that the sooner we begin to understand that a group who operates in this way, with a total disregard for law and order and the well being of other Bharatiya citizens, they are terrorists. They are unequivocally to be condemned as terrorists. And I think the broader Muslim community, especially the imams and the scholars, it's beholden upon them to declare them as terrorists, not to give them support, not to provide tweets which encourage other people to give them support. If that's not forthcoming, then we're moving into a very dark and potentially difficult future for all of us.
Yes, Bandiji, the concern is that with Islamists, they're now, like you said, they're lawless, they're vigilantes, they're taking it upon themselves to put the law into their own hands, and they go straight for the kill. Literally, they are going straight for the kill. How should the government now react to this in India? A lot of people say time for a Hindu Rashtra, you know, zero tolerance, death penalty instantly. How can we start? I would say nip this in the bud, but the bud has already beyond a bud. It's becoming quite tedious and tiresome because this is not the first time. We aren't surprised. Of course, it's shocking when there's a broad daylight beheading, but yet we knew as soon as you use the adjective that the man was beheaded, we all know who was guilty from which community. We just have to use beheaded. The world knew exactly which group had done that murder. What can India do? What can the government do? What kind of penalties, what kind of legislation can they introduce to now really have a zero tolerance on this?
So, a couple of points that you've just made, I'd like to extend the ideas on. Firstly, every human being has a principal right to life. This is a fundamental assumption of all societies, the right to life. After the right to life, we have the right to freedom of speech and the right to freedom of thought, etc. They're all built on this fundamental right, the freedom to life. Now, an extension of that is the right to defend oneself. And so I think the first step that needs to be taken, and it's a very pragmatic, realistic one, is that every Hindu and every Sikh and every Buddhist and every Jain and every Christian needs to give some thought to how they're going to defend themselves. Not for a moment am I advocating that we should recommend or permit everyone to carry guns and so on and so forth. We don't want the nonsense that's happening in the United States. Having
No,
said that, with the Bharatiya community, I don't think we'd have that nonsense anyway, even if the Bharatiyas were to decide that that's what the society wanted to do. But I think it's a very pragmatic approach that everyone should now consider: how do we defend ourselves? You see, it's all very well the apparatus of law coming in afterwards and sentencing the criminals and the terrorists to whatever penalty is deemed appropriate, but that doesn't bring Kanaiyalal back.
no,
It doesn't give the family their life back. It doesn't give his sons and his children um, a father back. And so the first priority is to preserve life at all costs, in whatever manner, way, shape, and form is appropriate.
yes,
The worrying thing, though, is that if a state is unable to provide protection for its citizens, for their basic human rights, then confidence in the state very rapidly disappears, and that's not what we need. We
no,
do not want for confidence in the governance and the state to be weakened. And this is an issue of perceptions. It would have been so good when, for example, Palghar happened and those poor sadhus were lynched. in
Yeah.
front of a police station if the state had responded with some sort of public announcement, or when Rinkuji was killed, or when Kamlesh Tiwari was killed, or now yet another Kanhaiya Lal. And yet the government has not spoken. It's not made announcements. It's not expressed sympathy. And that's a worry. People who are not particularly concerned about the politicking and the the governance issues and other relationships, the geopolitics, simple people will think, why has Kanhaiya been left unacknowledged? You know, in other countries, for example, when Samuel Paty was killed in France, Emmanuel
Mm.
Macron attended his funeral
Yes. Yeah.
and immediately said, "What I want is the picture that was deemed to be offensive. I want it to be portrayed across all of the buildings, the important government buildings across France. I want it to be projected upon them." So
Yes,
this
it
is
was
about
global. It's
perceptions,
viral. Je suis
and
Charlie Hebdo. We were all
yeah,
there.
yeah, and so this is about perceptions, and I'm a little concerned, and I don't understand why perception management has not been factored in and has not been dealt with in a much better way. We must remember here in the United Kingdom that philosophy teacher in Batley, is still in hiding, and it's now been over a year. It was March last year when all he did was, in a religious studies class,
That's right.
show a picture which had been shown in Paris. He wasn't criticizing anybody, he wasn't commenting on it, he was saying this is the sort of thing that happens. And
Yes.
just showing a cartoon, a picture, a graphic image was deemed to be so offensive that he too is in hiding. And he and his family are under threat, and they still haven't been released. They haven't resumed their life. And we're going to see more and more of these issues arising. I think it's really important for all governments now to step forward and to really draw a line in the sand and make statements, restore public confidence, and let's start to deal with this problem in the manner in which it needs to be dealt with.
I feel that maybe we need now the global community because it's not just India that's facing terrorist attacks, it's global. We all know, like I said, as soon as you say beheading, we all know around the world who are the guilty parties. Even in Holland, the Dutch MP, Geert Wilders, he was saying, why are India tolerating the intolerant? Um, you know,
Yeah,
we have to really go to the core of this. Maybe madrasas possibly need to be banned because they're being taught from a young age, children from a young age, how to behead. I mean, like you were saying initially, if we had guns to use for defense, most Hindus would not be comfortable using a gun. We don't kill, we respect life. Whereas, we have those in our society from a young age who are taught to kill. And we've witnessed it. It's not just talk.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there, i.e., at a young age. You see, there is a bit of clarity that our community, and in fact, not just the Bharatiya community, the global community, needs to achieve in order to be able to deal with this issue. As long as there's confusion, as long as you don't see the factors which are at play clearly, you can't find a solution. And it's almost as though everybody is struggling to find that solution. Here is a thought. If we get rid of the identitarian politics, get rid of the tribal names and everything else, let's dig deeper than that. In our tradition, we're taught to look beyond Nam and Roop, beyond name and form, and to look at the tattva, the essence of a problem. And the essence of this is that we're dealing with dogmas.
Mm.
Now, the thing about a dogma is that it's an assertion, it's a statement, it's not evidenced, it's not borne out by reason, it just is a statement. And it can be irrational, it can be unproven, but it's a statement that people refuse to abandon. That's what a dogma is. Now, those who study logic and reasoning, there is a fundamental rule, and that is that any dogma which is unproven does not need to be disproved. There is no proof for it, and so you don't need to disprove it. You need to recognize it as a dogma. Now, reasonable people will forever struggle to try and understand a dogma. This is the nature of reasonable people. And so they are forever trying to make a square peg fit into a round hole. and it will
Mm.
never happen. So the first step is we recognize when a dogma is at play, and then the question is this dogma illegal? Does it put forward illegal solutions, illegal penalties, illegal activities? Does it promote those? And if it is, then the dogma is at fault. Now, if it's a dogma and it's totally not illegal, it's harmless, then it falls within the space of religion and belief. And we have freedom to believe whatever we wish, whatever dogmas we want, so long as they don't transgress across law and they don't offend or harm anybody else's well being and they don't deny anybody human rights. So when you are faced with a
Mm.
dogma, you need to recognize that you will not understand it. You know, I met a man once who was in um, an asylum, and he was convinced that he was Napoleon.
Right.
Okay, so he believed this. He walked around with his arm across his chest and his hands tucked into his jacket. Now, that is an unreasonable dogma. He believed it, he wasn't willing to abandon it, and yet he believed it. But it didn't do any harm. And because it didn't do anybody else any harm, then fine, you try and make sure that their life is as comfortable as possible. But when you have a dogma which determinedly creates violence, then you need to recognize it not as a religion, not as a belief. You need to recognize it as an ideology which is based upon striking terror. So it is a terrorist dogma. And then you can deal with it. Now, it doesn't matter whether it's Abrahamic or whether it's Dharmic or whatever it is, the presence of a violent dogma can only be dealt with the use of force. Now, if I just pick up on the point that you made about madrasas, the best time to instill a dogma into a person is when they are young, when they're between the age of 3 to about 7. At
Yes.
that age, whatever an authority figure says to the child is accepted without scrutiny. They will believe it and it becomes part of their subconscious, it becomes part of their deep conditioning, and it's a dogma. And you can't dislodge a dogma by talking to people in that reasonable manner that we have. I'm sure you can recall only, I think it was last year, where we had an instance on London Bridge
Yes.
where the person who was also an Islamist, he had a machete and attacked a number of innocent bystanders, and yet he was the subject of a Cambridge University rehabilitation program, and they thought they had managed to stabilize him and rid him of any deep conditioning, but they were unsuccessful with it.
Yes.
So once we recognize the presence of a dogma, we don't need to worry about what it's called. It's just a dogma. And if
Yes.
it's a dogma, we can deal with it without having to struggle with the problems associated with tribalism or with religious tribalism or to do with religious ideologies. All of those can be put to one side. A dogma is a dogma and it needs to be dealt with as a dogma.
Thank you so much for that, Banditji. So going forward now, with India, what people want to see justice. We want to see a change. How can we put this into practice now? Because Hindus are a majority in India. Yes, we do have divisions with secularism, liberalism, communism, that sort of thing. But ultimately, if all Hindus united, none of this would happen. You know, unity in numbers, strength in numbers. Why are we so fragmented? What do you think is the reason?
Well, great question. As a student of history, there are some understandings which I think may be relevant to that question. Firstly, unity is only needed when faced with adharma or with violence.
Yes,
In the absence of those two, the foundational principle of dharma is diversity, where everybody is living doing their own thing. And so long as they're not sort of treading on each other's societal, religious, or philosophical toes, then they're welcome to do whatever they wish. So there is no necessity for unity in times of peace. Yeah, and that is traditionally what our Sanatani family has always been. This is why the whole nation, from the the depths of Kanyakumari all the way up to Gangotri and the Himalayas. You know, diversity. You can travel 20, 30 miles and be speaking a different language, be worshipping a different way, and still be welcomed as a human being, as a Sanatani. It's
Yes.
only when you are faced with violence or adharma that the community needs to work out how diversity unites in order to respond to a violent threat. And we're working that out now. You know, it's becoming apparent to everybody that the assault is actually on the dharmic ideology. What they hate about us is the fact that the Sanatanis worship humanity as an expression of divinity. And that is totally contrary to their dogma. When you have a Sanatani who believes that a human being is a perfect incarnation of Padmatma on a journey to reconnect themselves with Padmatma, then all of a sudden you have no illness for which somebody else has to provide you with a solution. Whereas if you want to continuously enslave people, you have to convince them that something is wrong and that you've got the solution to it. Okay? And you
Yes.
go every Sunday to go and receive a little bit of that solution. And you see, the thing about a dogma is that it's actually unnatural.
Yes.
Because as human beings, we are reasoning creatures. We want to understand. Understanding is important to us, which is
Yes.
why a dogma has to be driven in weekly. It has to be reasserted. You have to have it done in a very large group environment so peer group pressure can be brought into play as well. Whereas Sanatanis, we say, well, we can do our puja at home. Yeah? And we can do it on any day or at any time. And we've
Yes.
even got different days for different types of practices. And there is no there is no requirement for violence, intellectual or emotional, to be brought to bear to make you do something. Now,
No.
because we have this perspective, it's so hard to imprison and enslave intellectually and emotionally people who are Sanatani, because a dogma requires the destruction of anything which challenges it in order for it to survive, because it's not natural. Cannibals and vegetarians cannot live together in harmony. One believes it thrives on consuming the other, and the sooner the vegetarians realize that they're in the company of cannibals, the sooner they unite, the sooner they coordinate their resources and their efforts, the sooner they find voices, the sooner they find leaders, and then they can repel the onslaught of dogmatic cannibals.
Yes, Panditji. Just to touch on what you were saying before, that people don't need to normally unite, but only when they're faced with adversity. The issue is that with Indians and Hinduism, we have had adversity for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's not new. We've had the British invasions, the Mughal invasions. Why is it just recently, under some great leadership in India, that people are only just starting to wake up now? Why the delay? I mean, the perpetrators of this heinous crime in Udaipur, their own ancestors would have probably been forcefully converted. And look how far and deep and ingrained that brainwashing has gone to their future generations, to the point where
Mm.
they're attacking their own brothers. I mean, I'm still in shock that we are still, this is still happening. Why are we allowing this to still happen?
Sunoniji, we have to again look at a historical context, and then it becomes clear. Firstly, we have been on the receiving end of genocidal violence for so long that it's almost become normalized. Right? We have had, what, 350 years of Occidental Euro Christian oppression, prior to that, 800 years of the harshest Islamist oppression. And so we've moved into survival mode. But then what happens is when Prime Minister Modi ji came into office, is that it's almost as though a knee was lifted from our civilizational necks. Suddenly, we had the opportunity to stand up as a civilization and look about us. We had the freedom to breathe deeply and reflect and try and gather our faculties, our memory, our relationships, and start to piece together all of the shredded, torn fabric of our civilization. And so it's only over the last decade that we've been able to start to talk to each other about these things, to be able to find a way of organizing our hearts and our heads so that we can deal with this. And that process is still continuing. We've been given the space by the BJP in its current form, and they're the only ones, the only administration which has had a genuine appreciation for the indigenous civilization of Bharat. Prior to that, there was not nearly the devotion nor the respect of one of the oldest heritage civilizations, one of the First Nations, as there is now. That
Yes.
has given us the chance to look around and understand, well, why did they do this to us? Who were they? What was our true history? I'm sure you've maybe heard the response to the Kashmir files, where
Yes.
people in the south are now saying, we never knew that this was done to Kashmiri Hindus,
Yes.
right? And so there is
Many of us didn't know how deep it went.
absolutely, and so there is a fabric of communication, of networking, of friendship and relationships being resurrected. So we're moving from survival mode into
Yes.
what I call revival mode. And
Yes.
we're
It's a
staying in survival
renaissance.
mode. That's it.
Yeah.
Although this isn't a real word, but we'll move from revival into what I call thrival mode. And when we
Yeah.
start to thrive, that's when the Hindu will be able to protect themselves and their ideology and their civilization and the incredible gifts that we have to share with humanity. So
Yeah.
we're on a journey. At this stage, the most important thing, I can't emphasize it enough, is that every single Sanatani, every single Hindu recognizes every member of their civilization as family. Swami Vivekananda said it best. He said that you can only call yourself a Hindu when the pain of another Hindu brother or sister strikes you as deeply as though it was one of your own family. Then you become a Hindu. And this is
Yes.
something that we are now learning to do. And it's happening, I must admit. The speed with which it's happening is really encouraging.
Yes.
One
There's
of
an
the
awakening.
consequences, sure, one of the consequences, though, is that those who want to and need to destroy our vision of existence, they have seen that there is an awakening. And so between now and 2024, when the next general election is, sadly, those who can't afford for Bharat and Sanatanis to stand up tall and proud and say, this is who we were, and this is what our history is, and we now want to talk about recognition, reconciliation, restitution, and all of those things, they are aware that they need to prevent the Hindu identity from becoming reintegrated. And so
Yeah.
sadly, we're going to see even more gaslighting from the BBC. We're going to see even more New York Times articles which are based on nothing other than atrocity literature. And
Yeah.
as Hindus, each and every time this happens to us, we should use it as an opportunity to be able to, one, speak loudly against it, and two, hold each other tighter and stronger and make our bonds really, really firm so that we can navigate this and get to the stage where Bharat can stand up and share its vision for the benefit of the world.
Absolutely. Lots to look forward to. I really do feel we're on the right path finally.
I think so.
Finally. Thank you so much for your time today, Banditji. Look forward to our next liaison.
It's been my pleasure. I look forward to it as well. And thank you very much for raising this very sensitive subject and allowing us to deal with it in such a calm and reasonable manner. Jai Shri Ram, Slonaji. Best wishes to
Jai
you.
Shri Ram, Jai Shri Krishna. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Om.
Thank you.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.